Welcome. This is Lynn Fraser with the Kilby Center for Recovery. We're here interviewing Judy Crane for the Radical Recovery Summit. Judy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? And in particular, Judy has a specialty around trauma and addiction. So we'll be focusing on that today.
I'm Judy Crane. I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict in recovery, long-term recovery, 30 years this year. I have been a therapist for 29 of those years. Amazingly, I think I probably was a therapist from the age of 3 or 4. But I am a specialist in trauma, and I've been doing the trauma work for most of my career, because it was very clear to me that trauma, life events, family history were the core of relapse. And so I guess the things that I'd like you to know about me the most are that I was blessed to be able to create 2 treatment centers that work specifically with trauma in relationship to addiction, all addictions, substance, process, behavior addictions, and have had really good success with that because we're working with the core as opposed to focusing on the addiction. We see addiction as the behaviors as coping mechanisms and soothing responses to trauma. And I'm really grateful to be on this program with so many extraordinary people who understand and really are in the forefront of making sure that we do something different with addiction treatment. We can't continue to do what we've been doing for so many years. And so I'm grateful to be part of that.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. Scott Kilby, when he started working with the Summit right away, wanted to have you on the program. The Kilby Center has always recognized that trauma needs to be worked with. But that's fairly recently. He's only had the center open for about 4 years. How did you get to understand that connection between trauma and addiction? So much ahead of a lot of what a lot of people understand around addiction.
Well, there's something in the way that I view the world. I think that is really important. I see a bigger picture. I see the whole vista, and I have always. I can see things beyond where we are in the moment. And so when I started working, when I got into recovery, I came in there with a lot of baggage, my own baggage, a lot of trauma that I didn't understand that was trauma. And when I say that to clients, that's one of the first things they say is that's trauma. Well, yeah, there are layers and layers of trauma, but I think that I was blessed to be able to be working with people who it smacked me in the face. I worked in the criminal justice system. There were men who were going back to prison if they didn't complete a program and find sobriety. And out of 20 men, there was an experiential program, with the Sheriff's Drug Farm in Palm Beach County. And I got to work in that when I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but I was paying attention to these men and helping them to transition from this amazing program, 13-month program, back into a case management situation in halfway house. And their stories were, absolutely unbelievable. And they were going to go to prison for the rest of their life if they didn't get recovery for things like robbery and possession and all those things that they were sending people to prison for back then. When what was going on is they were addicts trying to find relief. So I got to see that, and then I worked with pregnant and addicted women. Same thing. Pregnant and addicted, getting pregnant over and over again, just like I did, not being able to stop using, and then listening to their stories. And their stories were very similar to mine, except they didn't have some of the resources that I had. They didn't have family. They didn't have in-laws. They didn't have they, they didn't have some education, and I had some education, and so they kept going back over and over and over again. And then I got to work at this other beautiful place for women, 26 women, and they came from they were trust fund babies down to streetwalkers. But they had the same stories, just with different accoutrements. Some of them had lots of money and were in domestic violence situations or sexual abuse situations, and some of them had nothing. But the situation was the same. They kept relapsing over and over again. They felt incredibly horrible about who they were. They were walking around with guilt and shame for the things that had been done to them, taking on that blame, that moral injury. And I had a mentor who really supported what I was seeing, because she got it. She really got it. But I had the language for it. And she sent me back to get my master's degree and helped to pay for that. And then gave me the opportunity to create a program that was different. And I got to work with the couples and be able to, help the healing. So she just gave me that opportunity to just fly, And unfortunately, she got very sick and had to step down after 20 years of that program. But at the same time, that was one of those situations where it gave me the opportunity, and I was praying for. I just would ask in ceremony. We had a burning bowl ceremony, and I would ask God, please help me to find a place to do treatment the way I know it will work. And I started doing these intensives all over Florida, and ended up in Ocala at this beautiful property where I could lease it for 1 weekend a month, and I did that for a year, and it was the refuge, and it became available. And a series of events happened that it was an opportunity where I got people who were willing to invest to create this program. And as a result of those retreats that we were doing, I could see that in really intense situations that we could get movement and release, and they were doing trauma work during these intensives. And so we made the leap, and we proved it. We proved that what we were doing worked. We were busy from day one. And interestingly enough, places like the Meadows and Sierra Tucson, which back then, they were the only people, the Meadows, Sierra Tucson, and Life Healing Center were the only people doing trauma work, but they were doing it in short bursts. They were only doing it in 2-week sessions, 28 days, which wasn't going to be enough. And they started referring to us. Enormous numbers of people. The Meadows would send 10 people at a time. Yeah, we had this great partnership where our alumni were delighted to be Meadows alumni and Refuge alumni. People were dumped in my lap, and my eyes were open.
So we were talking before we officially started the interview, about Dr. Gabor Mate and his understanding around trauma and compassion and treatment of trauma. And you also referred to a moment ago, people were surprised about, oh, that's trauma. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do you define trauma? How does all of that work?
I tried to simplify the definition, because I wanted people to recognize, trauma is distinct to every individual. So what's traumatic for you, Lynn, is not necessarily traumatic for me. But then we have these layers of trauma. But so the way I describe trauma is that trauma is any negative event, series of events, or long, ongoing series of events that impacts the way you vision yourself and your place in the world, changes the way you see yourself. And that happens really young for most of us. We delightful little children, hopefully, and then we're brought into the world, and things start happening. And sometimes we're not protected, and sometimes, more often than not, the people who are raising us really don't understand what it means to raise a child and the impact that their words or their actions have on us. So oftentimes the trauma is not purposeful. It just is. And when I saw Dr. Mattei, it was at a U.S. Journal conference, and I was speaking, but I don't usually get to go in and sit in on my colleagues very often, and when I do, it's limited. I went to everything that he presented that day. I saw him, and I was blown away because I had had dinner with Bessel van der Kolk. I had had dinner with Christine Quidwell, and I have had conversations with them, and they both told me that they know everything there is to know about trauma. They know nothing about addiction, and were willing to say that. Christine said to me when she worked for Elements, "Judy, I'm so excited." I said, "Well, I'm so glad that we're getting somebody who understands trauma." She said, "But I don't know anything about addiction." And I said, "I think I need to help you there because it's really important." But Gabor knew everything, and he got it. Relapse is created as a result of unresolved trauma. And it was just validation for 20 years of work at that point that someone with real heft and weight in the industry was validating the work we were doing. It was like, and I wanted to go grab him and say, "I'm doing that. I'm doing that." And I haven't had that opportunity yet. I got him to sign a book, but I haven't had the chance to say, "I'm doing this. I want you to know I'm doing this." And perhaps I will.
One of the things that he's really clear about too is that addiction should not be criminalized, that treatment needs to happen in a non-criminalized environment. Can you speak about that too in terms of the work that you do and who you work with?
Well, initially, the first people that I worked with were those men who were going to go to prison. They were considered 3-time losers. And as I said, they were in prison and chosen for this program. There were 20 men that were chosen for this program because they had number one identified as addicts, and 3-time losers for things like I said, robbery, possession, dealing. They weren't the cartel. They were street dealers, and they were going to go to prison for life. If they finished the program, if they finished this sheriff's drug farm program of 13 months and stayed sober, they were still going to be on probation, all of them, for the rest of their life, which meant, you relapse or mess up and you're going to go back to prison anyway. And they were addicts. Every single one of them with a trauma story that was painful. And if I can just tell one quick story, in my first marriage, my husband was my soulmate, but he was also my partner in addiction. And when I was 27, I came to after a night of using, and he had overdosed in the bed next to me. The pain of being in that marriage was that this beautiful man with this beautiful soul was capable of incredible violence under the influence of some drugs. And I knew which drugs. crystal meth and barbiturates. And the next thing I would know, I would end up in the hospital with broken bones and shot or stabbed and those kinds of things. And the pain of it was being able to see who he was and know that this was not, this was not him. So in any case, when I first started working with those men, I was asked to go in to, there was a specific jail cell where they were waiting to be accepted into this program. And it was a magnificent program with all the right, the sheriff had the right heart at that time to understand this. So they asked me to go in and tell my story. So I went in to the jail cell and I started telling my story. And in the midst of telling my story, I told about being a battered wife for those, for 5 years. And then that battering stopped as a result of a gift. But I turned around and there were 3 men in the cell who were crying. And after I finished speaking, they came to me because I told them, I was a woman who was using a different drug with each baby. They had been children of mothers of addiction, that I had been battered, and they had been people who had grown up in homes with domestic violence and then became their fathers. They had been men who left their children. And their hearts were as deep and as in as much pain as mine was, but they were in jail. And they were as good men as could possibly be, but they were in jail. They were in jail for their behaviors. They were in jail for their addiction. And I know that working with them and having a heart with them, I know that it made a difference. Because over the years, several of them stayed in touch with me.
That may have been the first time some of them had ever had a heart connection with somebody who wasn't shaming them and stigmatizing them.
Yes. And 2 of them are therapists.
Wow.
Working in Palm Beach County. Extraordinary when I think about it. That's extraordinary. And that was in 1994, 95. So they've been sober a long time now, too.
So you went from working in that program, and now do you mostly work with women now, or is it mixed groups?
It's very mixed group. At the refuge, it was extremely mixed. From again what we did at Wayside House, but co-ed, and from trust fund babies to people who are coming off the streets. When I owned the refuge, I was able to do. I was the primary owner and CEO. We had investors, but I was in control, so I could say, we're going to scholarship or keep someone. And at the end, we had given 30% scholarships, which was wonderful for me that we could do that because it's important. So the people we're working with now, again, are the same thing, wide range. Some trust fund babies. I had a client from Dubai. We have clients from London, from LA, and we have them from, we have quite a few from Ocala, which is a different demographic, different financial demographic, educational demographic. But it's a small program. It's 15 beds, and it's very family. I mean, they create a family, which again is part of that healing process because they're restructuring their trauma. They're facing it, looking at it, having some resolution, addressing their behaviors, the self-soothing. Because every one of them, there is not just substance. Never, ever, ever just substance. There's always a process addiction or a behavioral addiction in there. And so we're looking at when did that start? And there's something that I've been using when I speak that just recently, I had this revelation as I was standing on stage talking about soothing behaviors. And I said, You know, I can recognize the first soothing behavior that I had, and it was a sugar sandwich. You know, my mother and father were in the midst of some marital problems, and I was the oldest, and I was the one who was taking care of my sisters. And I would run downstairs and have a sugar sandwich and get relief, and then be okay to be able to handle everything that was happening in the house. When I said that on stage, the whole audience, it's amazing to see people raising their hands. So it'd say, so how many people have sugar sandwiches? And what's your sugar sandwich look like? So it's become, I think if I write again, I think we'll start with, what's your sugar sandwich? Because, that's what we do. We're going to find relief. And of course it becomes addictive, because now we've created something in our neural pathway that's giving us some oxytocin, giving us a love hug, and intervening on the the trauma neurotransmitter. I'm not sure if that answered your question. I kind of got off on a.
No, it did. Yeah, it's great. So one thing I would like to know a little bit more about is what do you see as the key components for working with trauma? You talked about creating a family. I can tell by what you've been talking about so far, there's a heart-to-heart connection. You're really seeing people. What is it that you do, like at the refuge or in what you're working with now? What are the key elements around treating trauma?
The new program is called the Guest House. It's called the Guest House because of Rumi's poem, The Guest House, and I invite anybody to read it. And it talks about inviting in the pain and the sadness and the sorrow and the grief along with the joy. And, that's one of the imperatives. We absolutely have to be able to make a space where we can bring in safely the pain, the grief, the sadness. Um, our, our clients, we call it the black dot. It's that black dot of pain where we have to go to. And oftentimes I'll go over to the guest house and ask our folks what's going on. I'm in the black dot, and you can see they're walking the property, or they're over with the horses, comforting themselves, or they're finding a space of safety, and they're in the black dot and allowing themselves to be in the pain. Now, the only way that can happen is for us to create a place of safety, a place of comfort, um, uh, and that happens with the people who are working there. Now, most of the people who work for me have been in treatment with us at one time or another, and they usually are the clients who have been with me 2 or 3 times. They're the ones that were most difficult, if you want to frame it that way.
Mhm.
It and I love it, because what has happened to them is this incredible miracle of coming back 2 or 3 times to treatment with us after maybe being in treatment 10 times somewhere else, and being able to have that process happen. So now they're working with our guests. We call them guests, and they've got it. They know. So we're creating the energy in treatment by having people who are loving and compassionate. The number one rule is that we never give up. And the staff are people who we never gave up on, and we don't. And they can say that to our guests, you may not get it this time, but we're not going to give up on you. We're going to call you. We're going to email you. We're going to be on the phone with you, repeatedly. Give up on you. So we're not going to let you give up on yourself. But there cannot be judgment, because you're going to hear the stories, as you know. And sometimes the stories, as deep as my trauma story is, there are trauma stories that just take my breath away. And at that point, I'm always going to say to a client, uh, how amazing that you survived that. And that's the beginning of being able to give someone a place to know that they have some resilience. So we have to be able to help our clients recognize how resilient they really are, that they've survived what they've survived. But we can't judge. And the minute someone tells a story and your face reflects fear, terror, or judgment, they'll stop. They'll close down. And so the people who work for me, like we've trained all our medical staff, some who this is their first time working with trauma survivors. So we've been able to train them to be able to listen to the stories and hear the stories. And can you compare what your life was? Because everybody's got a trauma story. And so there are those things: love, compassion, passion for what we do generates passion for the healing process for our clients. Non-judgment, lots of love, helping our folks to be able to develop attachment. So this dyadic attachment that we create with our folks is really important. They do it with their therapist. They do it with the chef. They do it with the housekeeper. They do it with our what you might call house managers. We call them, our house managers decided that they wanted to be called OGs, old guests, because they had done this work before. So now they were old guests.
Excellent.
Lead our guests. Our staff are amazing because they help to direct treatment as much as any therapist does. And then finally, really importantly, is helping our folks to get on a path of a life's purpose. Now, they may or may not find a life's purpose while they're in treatment, but if they get on the path of finding a life's purpose, it's really difficult to continue to use if you have a purpose. It's really difficult to relapse if there is any ability at all to see your own shininess and to see your own ability to be purposeful. I think that's why we have so many of our former clients who become therapists or who work in the industry, because they want to give. We want to get back. I mean, this was not my intent. I had no intention to be a therapist, but it's what happened.
I'm thinking of people who have had trauma and have been shamed for it and are shaming themselves for it. There's so much of that internalized shaming. How do you work with that? Is it part of just the general process of what happens around being around people who are accepting and not shaming you? Or are there ways that you work specifically with that?
There are, it's being around people who are letting you know how amazing you are and how wonderful, and that there is absolutely no way that it was your fault. One of the things that I have done from the beginning, and it was just an intuitive thing, was I have these 5 amazing grandchildren, and I have their pictures everywhere, various ages, and now they're 11, 13, 15, 20, 2 at 11, and I used to pull out their pictures when they were just little, and a client would tell me that they had been sexually abused when they were 5, and I would pull out the 5-year-old and say, "This is what 5 looks like. Is it his fault? Could it ever be his fault? No matter what your abuser said, could it ever be your fault? Ever?" And our guests, our clients, are often stunned at that because they're not looking at that little girl or that little boy. They're envisioning themselves in this body and taking on the shame of that little person. And so often the message has been, during the sexual abuse or the beating or the I mean, the words that parents say to children, the language, in the midst of it, they're taking on, and we call that moral injury. And we're blessed that this has come from the military, moral injury, along with PTSD. Our best research has come from war.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I look at this, that's a moral injury. When the perpetrator is saying to that child, "You have bad blood. It's your fault. You wanted this." Now, how does a child at 3 or 4 or 5 even imagine that? But that imprint of that accusation stays with us forever until someone helps us to release it. And that's our job, is to help them release it. There are lots of ways to do it. I mean, lots of different therapy, and what works for one person doesn't work for another. It might be breaking dishes and screaming. It might be, it might be breath work and being able to physically release from your body. There are just so many modalities. And for our therapists have this huge toolbox of therapeutic gifts that they have to use. And but it's an imperative to change the message. It's absolutely imperative to change the message, because otherwise we keep responding to the message, keep acting out the message.
And that's one of the reasons why it takes a while for this. It's not a 2-week, a 28-day program.
And again, that is, SAMHSA is showing us 90 days minimum. 90 days minimum. And over the years, I noticed that 6 months was, there was like this magical piece with 6 months. If we could have them for 90 days in intensive treatment, and then keep them with us in maybe a step down PHP in transitional living with us. The people who stay in Ocala with us for a year, fabulous recovery, because they're connected, because they stay close to family, which is us, and that piece is really important. We have noticed that people who go back to wherever, LA, Chicago, wherever, go back to their environment where they don't have this family surrounding them that loves them unconditionally, that we get phone calls. This is really hard. This is harder than I thought. People come back. A lot of people relapse to come back. And I need to tell you about Ocala. We're dead in the center of Central Florida. And the nickname for Ocala is Slow Cala. So people who come from New York and LA, this is a culture shock. The fact that they stay and recognize that their safety here is a really big deal. And I only tell you that because yesterday I had a woman tell me, who was only going to fly cross country and stay here a little while, that she's staying for treatment as long as she can, and she's thinking about staying in Ocala for 1 to 2 years. Well, that's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
It's like to know that something different, something has happened, and it's changing all the brain patterns, changing all those messages, and it's a lot of work.
Well, and as you're talking about slow Cala, I'm thinking of people with that kind of antsy, agitated energy and anxiety. It must be a very difficult transition to go from that into all of these months of really healing the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Takes time for that to settle too.
Yes. And thank you, thank you for saying that, because I think that oftentimes I get to chatting about the core and the soul, and I forget to mention how imperative and important all of the body work is, because this is a disease of the nervous system. Post-traumatic stress disorder is exactly that, and so when we do so much body work, somatic experiencing, breath work, meditation, yoga, all those pieces it is all about healing the nervous system. One of the things that we use quite a lot, and I am a huge proponent of neurofeedback and cognitive repair, and we do that with we have a brain mapping that we can do here if the clients are willing, if the families are willing, and being able to brain map and see exactly how the brain has changed, and how we can help to repair it. And we have two wonderful programs, two different neurofeedback programs, and one is a cognitive repair program, and it's been incredibly successful, doing exactly that, changing the neural pathways and which changes the behaviors, which changes the messages, and so again, it's just so there's so much involved in healing PTSD because we have to do it in all the ways, body, mind, and spirit. I mean, you cannot just do one, and we have been doing just one for years in doing addiction treatment, and we have failed miserably.
It's clear that there's a holistic model that needs to happen in order for the complexity of addiction to be dealt with. How do you work with the multiple addictions that people have? You talked about substance as well as process and behavioral. So are you abstinent in some? You require that in some, but not in others? How do you work with that whole stream of how that all flows together?
We work with them all at the same time.
Okay.
So, for instance, at the moment, we have a gentleman who has an enormous eating disorder, and came to us really over 600 pounds, and we were able to take him. Number one, because he was physically capable of experiencing our program, but at the same time, because he was absolutely aware that his eating disorder was a direct result of a traumatic childhood, and he even had some insight into what the work was going to look like. And he made a commitment from the beginning, that he was going to be there 90 days, was willing to stay 6 months, was willing to stay as long as he can, and we already knew that it wasn't just eating. There was no substance, but there is a huge sex addiction involved, and so we're working with all of it, and no clients, particularly with process addictions, you're going to deal with that almost throughout the whole time folks are in treatment. You're going to watch how the process addiction stays active for a period of time, because you're opening up to trauma, sugar sandwich, and being able, for instance, to train our psychiatrists to recognize that, so that they don't get panicked and medicate everybody's feelings.
Right.
So we're working with several relationships, sex addiction, eating disorders, all at the same time. So we've got the overeater and the anorexic, along with everybody else, and we can do that because, number one, we're small, but what we have is experts in all those areas. So I have several CSATs, myself included. My son is one of the best in the country. We have one of the best eating disorder therapists, and we all work together as a team. So everybody has been trained in all of those process addictions, as well as trauma, as well as substance, and then we have the people who are the experts. But if you don't, when our substance abusers come in, there is always something else, and relationships are usually the piece where relapse happens. And if you don't do the work around that, what you're going to find are your folks are going to relapse in their process. And if you don't identify that for them, then the relapse almost shocks them. Well, I was doing my program, And I was going to a meeting every day. I
Hmm.
wasn't using. I was talking to my sponsor. I was doing my step work. I don't understand what happened. Well, what happened is you went into a meeting and connected with another addict and were having a sugar sandwich. And if you don't do that work while they're in treatment, it's an inevitable piece because it's a piece of the trauma work. And most of our clients, it's going to be relationships because trauma is a failure in attachment.
So there's a big pull to that, to relationship, and it's not always a safe and healthy relationship. Right.
And so if we're helping our folks to create relationship in treatment with their therapist, with their group, with a larger group, with staff, and we're modeling what relationship looks like, what healthy relationship looks like, you know, that's really important. That's how folks begin to understand what relationship looks like. How many of our clients come in and cling to us because we're the first person that ever said to them, you're a beautiful human being, and and I love who you are.
Right.
And that's like this wonderful validation because they've never heard that. Sometimes I say that and I can see a client that they'll jump back like I hurt them. No one's ever said that to them before. And it feels so unfamiliar that it feels like an assault. Then we have to go slowly.
And it might not be believed.
It absolutely usually is not believed. Yeah, you're right.
So there's all of these pieces that are so crucial for healing from trauma and healing from addiction. What about the people who are not able to come to a treatment center like yours? What are your suggestions for some pieces that they could put together for themselves?
Well, what I have done and what is happening all over the country now, because I've done a lot of trainings. I have a training program called Spirit2Spirit S2S, and so I've trained a lot of folks, a lot of therapists, and I've trained some other treatment centers, wonderful treatment centers. Capstone, which is an adolescent program for young men. Ascend, which is a program in Utah. Um, Augustine Recovery, which is in up here in Florida. Where else have I trained? Red Oak. So those programs now are doing intensives, like I was doing. So 5-day, 10-day intensives. They're bringing in family. They're bringing in folks who don't have the money to go to treatment, but might have the ability to come into an intensive. And many of those folks are doing scholarships, like I do, trying to bring people in. But this whole country, never mind the country, the whole world is in a trauma reaction. And, I don't know what the answer is to that. There are days when I want to get on a plane and fly to Syria and, and hold those babies. It's just, I don't know what the answer is, except that the more people we train, the more people who do their trauma work, that there's a synergy that happens. And I see it happening because our clients, our guests go home and they impact the people in their lives. They help to facilitate change. I am excited when I go into 12-step meetings in Ocala. When I first used to come to meetings here in 2003, I would go in and there were certain old timers that would look at me and just be, I could see there was anger. And they would say things in meetings like, you don't work on trauma till you're 5 years sober. My response was, people die in 5 years if they don't do their trauma work. Or they would say, I've been a trauma victim and I'm sober and I'm sober 20 years. And, there was a lot of displaced anger when I would walk into a room, and it's not that way anymore. Especially here, because so many of our folks are trauma survivors in recovery, doing the beautiful, amazing things. And I was just telling a friend of mine that there's this old timer who's really my age, but he's an old timer, and I had been going to a meeting at noon that he goes to, and for the first time since I opened the program in 2003, he has come down and patted me on the shoulder and said, "Judy, how you doing?" And he's speaking differently in meetings. I mean, really. And I said to one of my friends, I said, "What happened to our friend? Something happened to him." He said, "I think he's done his trauma work."
Wow.
How extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that it's going to happen is for us to continue to train people in this work and how to do it and how to understand it. So I had heart surgery. I told you that, and I was in the hospital, and after the surgery, and I had wonderful surgeons, really wonderful surgeons, and just with the best bedside manner, kind and considerate. And they saw my book. Somebody brought my books, and he asked me about it. And it's called The Trauma Heart. And I told him what it's about. And I said, how much education did you all get in addiction? He said none. And how much in trauma? He said none. Well, I already knew the answer to that. He said, what do you see? And of course, he's a heart surgeon. He sees it all the time. So he asked for my book, and his PA asked for my book, and the doctor at the rehab asked for my book, and the rehab techs asked for my book. And it was awesome because they really are reading it. The emergency room people are really aware of it. I work with some impaired professionals, and there are ER docs in there, and anesthesiologists, and respiratory therapists who relapsed in substance, and so I get the opportunity to go in and talk to them, and every one of them has been traumatized. They're in the industry number one because they're trauma survivors. But being able to talk about what it's like for them to be in an ambulance trying to help someone survive. If, we can do the work. We can do the work in smaller bunches if we can go to places like ERs and EMTs, and they're open. They want it. The rehab that I had to go to, the cardiac rehab, they asked me to come back and speak to their staff. Now that's really awesome. This whole thing that's happening in Houston, here we are. It's the 28th
Of August, yes. They're still in the midst of the...
Houston is flooded. Every human being in Houston is experiencing the most incredible kinds of trauma, and you can see it in their eyes. I watched 2 elderly people be pulled out of a house yesterday, and they're practically catatonic. They're so dissociated. And what are we going to do for those people? And I can't tell you how many of those folks had come from Louisiana to get away from Katrina, and now are experiencing this next horror. And they're sending water, and they're sending food, and they're sending people to come and rescue them. But Houston needs a lot of trauma therapists.
Right.
And I'm going to say something that's probably anathema, but trauma-informed information is not enough. That's not trauma treatment, as you know.
Right.
And a whole lot of places got trauma-informed information, with the idea that they then would know how to do trauma treatment, and recognize now today that they've got the information, but they still don't know how to do trauma treatment.
Right.
And if we don't train these other programs, then we can expect that we will continue to have chronic relapse. We will continue to have overdoses. We will continue in this horrible situation of the increase in suicides. That is overwhelming the number of suicides, and I know what that's about. The suicides are about guilt and shame. They're about remorse. They're about hopelessness. They're about I'm not worthy to live. They're about I am doomed to hell for the things I've done. And there's a solution, but the solution can only come when we have enough people who know how to do what we know how to do. And
Well, and all the way through, as you've been speaking, it's so clear that we need to do our own trauma work in order to be safe for other people. There's no shortcuts.
Absolute. And in this book, and what I was able to do, there are so many therapists who gave me their stories in this book, who did their work. And, I won't hire anyone unless they have done their work and have done it, generally speaking, with us. So we know that. And they understand that one of the requirements to work with us is that you have to have snot and cried and weeped and wailed. Snot and cried and weeped and wailed. And we laugh, but that's really what has to happen. And so in the book, the willingness of therapists to put their stories in there, and most of them kept their real name, but to be able to share what it was like for them to be, trauma victims, trauma survivors, and what their process was and how they got to the other side of it. But it's, we're the people, trauma survivors are the people who help to heal trauma survivors. And the reality, I think, is if you haven't done your own work, if you don't have work to do, you probably shouldn't be a therapist.
Right.
That's kind of a blanket statement, but but certainly if you haven't done your own work, you're going to do damage to yourself, and you're going to do damage to your clients, because it's going to come unawares to you. What transference happens, countertransference and transference you're going to have, and it's going to surprise you. And you might, and really for some people, they're not even aware that it's happening to them, but it's their stuff. And I really applaud therapists who come in, and they're doing that at the intensives that we put on. Lots of therapists coming and doing their work so they can go back. And when I train a treatment center, that's what happens. The whole treatment center comes together. Their team comes together. That's extraordinary. That they come together, 20 staff usually, and they know coming in that this is going to happen, and they're willing to expose themselves to their team. Now that's a team solid and built on a place of trust and a place of intimacy, and that that I think is amazing. And so those places that I named, that's what they've done, and their team is spectacular as a result. The work that they do is spectacular because they've done their, they're not ashamed to say that they were sexually abused, or that their behavior was out of line, and in their disease, what they were capable of. So yes.
So let's talk
I've been
about
known to stand on this stage and say, if you haven't done your own work, it's unethical for you to be a therapist. All these years that I go to conferences, and that's how it started. I would go to conferences knowing that I needed to know about trauma. And I would go to all these wonderful people who were brilliant, but weren't telling me how to treat trauma.
Mm-hmm.
They were telling me everything I needed to know about the signs and symptoms and what created trauma. And the only one that was Peter Levine, and I knew
Right.
that it wasn't enough for addicts. But when I heard Gabor, it was just extraordinary. Just validation that everything that I had discovered over the years, that someone else with some real weight and real understanding, was getting that, and it
Mm-hmm.
was understanding the connection between addiction and trauma.
Mm-hmm. And I have a background with trauma, and a lot of the people I work with are people with trauma as well. And Scott, when he started the center, realized right away that that needed to be trauma first. You can't treat the addiction without treating the trauma.
We got the opportunity to do something that other people weren't doing. Um, when I worked when I first started. I was an addict who just didn't believe for a minute that I was ever going to get sober. I was 42, and all the things that I had been capable of doing in my addiction just were overwhelming, and the things that had been done, and and so um, the universe just provided this opportunity. Just really did.
Mhm.
I was looking for a place to be able to do trauma treatment the way I knew it should be done, because I had been working with the criminal justice system, and was seeing these men who were three-time losers going to go back to prison for the rest of their life if they didn't get this recovery thing. And every one of them had these horrendous stories like
Right.
mine, uh, but they ended up in prison. Um, and then I was working with all of these pregnant and addicted women, um, and I had been a pregnant and addicted woman, and I was watching how um, I had at least had the comfort of family around me. They were
Mhm.
walking the streets pregnant, and and they weren't going to get sober. There wasn't a chance that they were going to get, not a chance. At the time I was married, I'll tell this story. It's interesting. Um, and I would be driving down with my husband down Broadway in Palm Beach, which is where the girls were walking the streets. They were prostituting themselves and pregnant, and they would come into treatment and not stay and go right back because they were as addicted to the street life as they were to anything else. And so my husband and I would be driving down, and I would yell, "Pull over, pull over," and it would be one of my girls, and I would try to convince her to come back to detox and then come back to treatment center. It was called Panda, Pregnant and Addicted, and um, my husband used to go into 12-step meetings and say, "I think I'm the only man in Palm Beach County that picks up hookers and doesn't get laid." Um, and then he would tell the story about his wife picking up these girls and taking them to detox, and um, but they weren't getting sober.
Mhm.
They couldn't. They would go back to jail. They would have their babies. They would give their babies up. I would go to court with them. They would try to get their babies back. They would do. Very few of them would do the next right thing,
Mhm.
which that was me. Um, and then I started working at this beautiful program in Palm Beach County, at Wayside House in Delray. And I had this mentor there, Phyllis Michael Felder, and she was just the most extraordinary woman. She came from Palm Beach aristocracy. She knew those people there. She used to go and metaphorically knock on their doors and say, "Okay, you're sober now. It's time for you to help some other people, and she would get donations for them and keep that program running, and we would be able to keep women there for a long time, minimum of 3 months, and she could keep them up to a year because she was that good of a fundraiser, and she really gave. There were 6 therapists. We were all in recovery, all women, um, and she gave each of us the opportunity to be able to work in in the way we knew best. We would sit at the staffings at lunch every single day, and she would read the next client that would be coming in. She was so funny, so funny. She'd say, "Judy, you have this woman coming in, and she has been battered and beaten and physically abused, and you are the world's leading expert on physical abuse and domestic violence, so you're going to get her." And that would be that day. That would be my expertise that day. She would turn to Debbie and she would say, "And there's this other woman coming in, and she has 2 children, and the court is ready to take them away from her, and we're going to be able to work with her and her children. And we know, Debbie, that you're the world's leading expert on mothers and children." And Debbie really was. And then we had another woman who worked with nurses and doctors, and uh, and Phyllis just knew who would be able to connect, where an attachment would take place. And those women were really, really successful. They would go into the 12-step meetings in Delray, and they were called the Wayside Winners. They owned that, just like when I had the refuge. Our refugees, our alumni owned that because they knew that there was something special that was happening.
Right.
And it's funny. We had a Rule 15, and it was everybody in Delray and all the 12-step meetings knew about Rule 15. It was that you couldn't socialize with men. And so it was the famous Rule 15. And if you broke Rule 15, then, there were consequences to pay. Because Phyllis was really aware that, one of the biggest triggers are the relationships.
Right.
But, she was extraordinary.
That sounds wonderful. The subtitle of your book, do you want to just say that quote and what that means to you?
The title is The Trauma Heart, and the subtitle is "We're Not Bad People Trying to Get Good, We're Wounded People Trying to Heal." And that was one of the, there's a story about that. The first time I went to treatment, I was in treatment twice, and the first time I went to treatment, it was in 1986, and I didn't know very much about AA, and even in 1986, there weren't a lot of women in AA at the time. So I was admitted to a treatment center in a forest in New Jersey, and it had been a treatment center for priests initially, and so my first night there was a speaker meeting, and the woman who was speaking. Well, let me back up. As I'm walking in the door, I have all these, enormous numbers of secrets that I was never going to tell ever. The same call that so many of our trauma survivors have. I was going to go to my death with the secrets, and just consumed me. The phrase I used the most back then was "I'm sorry." I would bump into a chair or bump into a wall and say "I'm sorry." It was everything. And so this woman speaker, she was sharing her story and all of the things. And when we say this all the time in 12-step recovery, someday you're going to hear your story. And she was, all the secrets that I had, she was telling, the things that had happened with me as a mother, the things that had happened with me as a wife, as an addict. She did criminal, illegal, immoral, unethical things she had done. And at the very end of her speaking, she said, "We're not bad people trying to get good. We're sick people trying to heal." And I have changed that over the years. But that statement made it possible for me to come into recovery. Now, I relapsed after treatment because I took a boy home. But that famous relapse situation. But the next year I got it. But it was that statement that made it possible for me to believe that I could go in and tell my story, which I did at the next treatment center. I did that with, there were 7 men in my group. And I had finally been telling my story like a shopping list. This happened, this happened, this happened. The opening line was, I was born October 1945, and I'm pretty sure I'm responsible for the atomic bomb. And because that's how much guilt and shame. And then I just listed all these things that had happened in my life, all the things that I'd done, all the things that had been done to me. And I read them, with no emotion, no feeling, which is what our clients often do because they have to dissociate from the events, from the pain, and that's what I was doing. And when I looked up, there were 7 men, and some of them were tough guys from South Philly, that I knew their history. And several of them were crying, and they were crying for me. And they were crying for what had happened. They were crying for themselves. And it was shocking. And that was so there were those 2 events, but it was the point of saying, we're not bad people trying to get good. We're sick people trying to heal. And I changed that to wounded people because I don't believe we're sick.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I had a client say that to me this week. That in the book, she said, I read in the book and you said, we're not sick. Do you know how important that is? My family thinks I'm sick.
Right.
I said, I know. And no, you're not sick. You're not sick at all. You're wounded.
Mm-hmm.
Big deal. I mean, that's a big deal for us. Because they're trying to medicate her and diagnose her, and she's a woman with enormous layers of trauma. That subtitle, for any of us with experience, that should resonate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about how people could get in touch with you. What are the websites? What's the best way to do that?
The very best way is through the guest house website, which is www.theguesthouseocala.com. And you go on there, and there'll be a place for you to send an email. You can email me, jcrane@theguesthouseocala.com.
Okay.
And I will do my best to respond to you or have somebody respond. And if you go to the website, I believe there's some other places that I believe will give you some resources as well.
Mm-hmm. And what about professionals? What about professionals for your training?
Yes. We have the Spirit2Spirit website as well for trainings. And I have a wonderful assistant, and her name's Kat Cross, and her title is Director of Creative Possibilities.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, she sets up the trainings, and she sets up the intensive. So that should be on both of those sites as well. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the guest house will also take it to the Spirit2Spirit site. And
Right.
And we can also direct you to some other intensives that other people are giving.
Right.
And fortunately, a whole lot of people that I've trained are doing them all over the country. I have a wonderful man who's in Portland who's doing them in the Pacific West Coast. I have a young man who's in LA and another woman in LA, and they're doing intensives, and they're doing them in Arkansas. So we're trying to spread that gift around.
Is there anything that you haven't said that you wanted to say before we finish?
I guess if you're listening to this and there's pain in your heart and you have some secrets, take a risk. Take a risk and find somebody that that you can trust, and begin the conversation. And if there's no one in your life that you can begin the conversation with, go to the website and begin the conversation, and we'll help you find somebody. There are good therapists throughout the country who know how to do this work and can help. And I think that that's important, because those secrets are just gnawing at the guilt and shame and the remorse and the pain. And Oprah tells us we need to live our best life, and you can only do that when you've done your own work.
Right.
And if you're a therapist and you're listening to this, please do your own work. Let's be in integrity.
Well, thank you very much, Judy. It's been wonderful talking with you, and your work over decades has really been authentic and trustworthy and has helped so many people. And although we're not looking at addiction in a narrow focus, we're looking at what are the real root causes of addiction and what can really help people recover. And your work and this interview has covered all of that. So it's wonderful to have your voice in this conversation.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Go to KillibyCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.